This is part 2 of our hunt for knowledge, wisdom, and courage that can guide us toward a more productive, secure, and culturally mature society. If you missed part 1, the link is down below. Our focus is on the United States, but no matter what country in which you live, the principles are the same. And the universal, eternal, and ultimate goal of life is to grow beyond our primate nature, sometimes called our monkey mind, and awaken the human body to the divine transpersonal nature that sleeps within. This has always been since man emerged here on Starship Earth, and it will remain so until humankind is no more. In part 2, we're going to explore an ideal transcultural paradigm, in other words, a visual model for 21st century physical culture that we can apply to any society with any religion or lack of it. But first, let's head back to part 1 and revisit this physical training diagram from the 1953 California Boys High School Physical Education Manual. It is often called extended rectangular, but it is more precisely an uncovered extended rectangular formation, because the boys in the even row, as you can see, have taken a wide step to the left. This gives them more room for prone and supine exercises such as the push-up, squat thrust, and the rower. It also allows the platform instructor and the boys to better see one another. In 1953, boys and girls had separate physical education classes beginning in 7th grade. Men taught boys and women taught girls. This all began to fade away in 1972, when the federal government passed a law requiring boys and girls to take physical education classes together at all grades. Predictably, physical education, already in decline, quickly became a waste of time, energy, and resources. It's a great example of how centrally controlled education, as President Dwight D Eisenhower warned long ago, in the hands of inept lawmakers, has contributed to the decay of American society. It was part of what we now call Title IX, and we'll visit that cultural train wreck again down the road. But first, let's go back and take a closer look at the uncovered extended rectangular formation. It was widely used by schools across the United States in the early 1950s because many physical educators back then had served in the military, where efficient mass physical training was essential and common. These veterans brought those methods home and eventually employed the uncovered extended rectangular and other standardized formations. You will also notice it was ideally led from an elevated platform, as in the military back then, because teaching and leading mass physical training from the ground is simply ill-conceived and inefficient. In those days, during World War II and following the Korean War, high school boys were expected to learn how to lead and teach the various drills. In this illustration, the adult physical educator is in the back of the formation and the student leader is on the platform. The physical educator is using standardized hand signals to assist the boy leading the drills when needed. Boys 2, 3, 4, and 5 are assistant instructors, AIs, ready to move through the formation and give technical assistance to their peers when needed. The AIs learn to provide guidance, usually no more than 2 words, to make corrections, such as head up, eyes forward, back straight, feet together, etc. Boys needing more assistance were expected to practice on their own or in small groups until they acquired the proper motor skills. Qualified physical educators selected only the drills their boys were capable of doing with a degree of accuracy. This was known as the rule of rational progression. The drills became more difficult as skill developed. With guidance from the physical educator, students learn to become good teachers and to likewise respect their peers who lead the classes. They learn that when on the platform, they should have a strong physical presence like good posture, a precise knowledge of the drills, and what was called back then command voice. Many physical educators who served in the military back then were trained to use and teach all of this. Richard Sharretts published a book on command voice in 1956. It was used by West Point cadets, and it was widely adopted by physical educators until sports and games eventually took control of post-war physical education and killed physical and motor fitness training in the mid-1960s as old physical educators began to retire. As we discussed in Part 1, the U.S. Army initially built its physical readiness training system from the early physical educators like German-American Turner Herman J. Curler, the father of U.S. Army physical readiness training. The anti-fitness physical educators that began to control physical education all the way back to around the 1920s called this sort of mass training militaristic and insisted it would turn students into mindless fascist robots. Sports, they said, build character. Physical and motor fitness training was useless and harmful. It was, of course, a misguided direction that has led us into our current cultural decay. Now, the Army still uses the uncovered extended rectangular formation. Here's an online example.
Fall in.
The Army's traditional formation for PT activities is the extended rectangular formation. It is simple, easy to assume, and may be applied quickly, making it ideal for mass training.
The extended rectangular formation.
The PT leader positions the unit in a line formation, so the unit will be centered 5 paces away from the leader after they have assumed the extended rectangular formation. The PT leader gives specific, consistent commands.
Extend to the left. March.
Soldiers in the right flank file stand fast with their left arm extended sideward with palms down, fingers and thumbs extended and joined. All other soldiers turn to the left and double time forward. After taking the sufficient number of steps, all soldiers face the front and extend both arms sideward with palms down, fingers and thumbs extended and joined. The distance between fingertips is approximately 12 inches and dress is to the right.
Arms downward. Move.
The soldiers lower their arms smartly to their sides.
Left face.
Soldiers execute a left face.
Extend to the left. March.
Soldiers in the right flank stand fast with their left arm extended sideward with palms down, fingers and thumbs extended and joined. All other soldiers turn to the left and double time forward. After taking the sufficient number of steps, all soldiers face the front and extend both arms sideward with palms down, fingers and thumbs extended and joined. The distance between fingertips is approximately 12 inches and dress is to the right.
Arms downward. Move.
Soldiers lower their arms smartly to their sides.
Right face.
Soldiers execute a right face.
From front to rear. Count off.
Front soldiers in each column turn their heads to the right rear and call off 1 and face the front. Successive soldiers in each column call off in turn 2 and so on. The last soldier in each column does not turn their head and eyes to the right while sounding off.
Even numbers to the left. Uncover.
Even-numbered soldiers sidestep to the left squarely in the center of the interval, bringing their feet together. To reassemble the formation, the PT leader gives this command.
Assemble to the right. March.
All soldiers double time to their original positions in the formation.
Youth fitness levels were much higher, and fat children were much less common in the USA during the early 1950s than today. But there were still many who needed extra help that was provided by what was once called special physical education. It had 3 components. Correctives addressed poor posture and body mechanics deficiencies, sometimes called clumsiness today. Developmental physical education focused on boys who were too unfit or overweight to join the mainstream. And adapted physical education was aimed at boys with specific medical or mental conditions. Corrective and developmental physical education died by around the mid-1970s as our national physical culture began to quickly devolve. For instance, this college special physical education textbook was published in 1972. By then, the majority of the content focused on adapted physical education. Corrective and developmental PE was squeezed into the last 2 short chapters and eventually faded away. Today, all the fit, fat, and unfit boys and girls suffer through the same ill-conceived physical education classes. On-the-ground physical training in the early 1940s and 50s sometimes included bodyweight conditioning drills and numerous handheld tools like dumbbells, Indian clubs, medicine balls, and weighted bars called wands. The cadence was either 4 or 8 counts, and the first and final positions were always the same. Proper rhythm was essential, and it took practice. Both sides of the body were trained in harmony to ensure symmetrical development. I was the Iowa Department of Education physical education subject matter expert for all the K through 12 public and private schools in the state from 2001 to 2014. In those years, I worked with forward-thinking teachers to rebuild programs based on the old classical functional physical education model. The mainstream older majority of physical educators, most often physically unfit and unprepared to teach rational physical and motor fitness training, called me a militaristic dinosaur and constantly conspired against me. The Department of Education joined the attack, and my efforts to rebuild physical and motor fitness here in Iowa failed. Perhaps someday we will overcome our ignorance, but until then, the children and youth here in Iowa will grow increasingly more inert, malformed, and clumsy. But let's return to the early 1950s. On-the-ground physical education was often aligned with off-the-ground physical training in uncommon postures, including brachiation, which means hanging from the limbs, extension, which is leaning backward, and inverted training, like headstands, handstands, forearm stands, shoulder stands, and such. Redwood City, California had an exemplary program led by Frank Griffin. His methods, material, and motivators were influenced by numerous visits to military installations across the country, and his students would eventually grow up and recall fondly how his program molded them into highly fit and physically literate adults. This is called the atomic loop and provides a clue into his motivators. Griffin and many of his peers understood that our national survival depends on producing fit, smart, and vibrant citizens who will become productive, disciplined, and honest citizens prepared at any time to defend the highest ideals of the country at home or abroad. Let's also take another look at Dr. Hans Krauss. We met him briefly in part 1. You might recall he is known as the father of sports medicine in the United States. He was President Kennedy's secret doctor, and his landmark fitness test of the early 1950s led to the development of the President's Council on Physical Fitness in Sports. President Eisenhower eventually saw the Krauss study and called a committee together to discuss it. This was in the early 1950s. The committee eventually became the President's Council on Youth Physical Fitness. The committee, according to Dr. Krauss, quickly agreed that sports and games should be their focus. President Kennedy, in the early 1960s, eventually tried to shift to physical and motor fitness, but that vision died with him in Dallas in November of 1963. Krauss eventually realized that the President's Council was hopelessly adrift and disconnected from it. I told you Dr. Krauss immigrated to the USA in 1930, but in fact, he and his family fled Europe in 1938 as World War II began to unfold. Dr. Krauss was born in 1905 in what is now Trieste, Italy, which at the time was part of the 1867 to 1918 Austro-Hungarian Empire. In 1938, the Krauss family fled Europe just ahead of World War II and settled in New York City, and Krauss was not allowed to enlist in the United States military because he had been born in Trieste, which had belonged to the Habsburg Empire at the time of Krauss's birth. Therefore, he was technically considered an enemy alien, even though he was a legal immigrant and a Jew. He became a U.S. citizen in 1945. It's unfortunate that Dr. Krauss was not allowed to serve in the military. He would have been of immeasurable value. As I mentioned in part 1, I called Dr. Krauss numerous times in the 1970s and early 80s We had long conversations about what he saw in his life and work. Dr. Krauss was always welcoming and pleased that a young physical educator like I had studied his writings. He inspired me to start looking more carefully at how people move. Here's an example from his 1965 book we discussed in part 1. Look at people you know are tense, he wrote. How do they move their bodies? Certainly not smoothly. Their body movements are not fluid or rhythmic, but jerky and stiff. They freeze themselves into a position whether they are sitting in a chair, standing, or driving a car. They force their muscles into steady, alert reaction. Their muscles already under tension are forced to become more tense. The muscles of the neck, shoulder girdle, and back are particularly tense, and they become prime target areas for even more tension. In other words, Dr. Krauss saw that American children were losing their ability to move efficiently. He linked it to a condition called hypokinesia, not enough exercise, and parakinesia, clumsy and unnatural body movement caused by a lack of motor development. Our loss of grace, poise, balance, and physical intelligence is an extraordinary national crisis, and both quality and quantity of human movement must be considered when we eventually seek to improve our national physical culture. Dr. Krauss opened my eyes to the poor posture and body mechanics all around me. I began to notice how many people slouch and communicate through incoherent gestures and walk more like primates than humans. I learned early on to approach this all carefully. Dr. Krauss explained that seeing it too clearly would bring me great suffering and professional peril. He was correct. In one of our conversations, I asked Dr. Krauss what it was like to work with President Dwight D Eisenhower as they created the President's Council on Physical Fitness. I was personally interested in Dwight David Eisenhower because he was my president from the time I was 7 years old until I was 15. I can't imagine how often I watched him and heard him speak. I didn't always know what he was talking about, but as I got older, it began to make more sense. Here's an example of some of what he wrote and said. Think about it as you look around today. He said, "It will be a sad day in this country if children can safely attend their classes only under the protection of armed guards." He said this in 1957. Isn't that something? I was 12 years old. He also wrote, "A good teacher is one who can understand those who are not good at explaining and explain to those who are not very good at understanding." Here's another one. Unless education continues to be free in its response to the local community needs from any suggestion of political domination, and free from impediments to the pursuits of knowledge by teachers and students, it will cease to serve the purposes of free men. How about this one? We know that education, centrally controlled, finally would lead to a kind of control in other fields which we don't want and will never have. So we are dedicated to the proposition that the responsibility for educating our children is primarily local. I remember when he passed away in 1969. I was an infantryman, far from home, and I felt sad, like we had lost something important. Cadet Eisenhower was at West Point from 1911 to 1915. That's when Lieutenant Colonel Herman J. Curler was there. He retired in 1923. And by the time young Eisenhower arrived, there he is, third from the left, sports were beginning to become dominant in the United States. As you can see, he's smaller than many of the guys. And almost immediately, he blew out his knee, and it would haunt him for the rest of his life and limit his physical capacities. After he graduated in 1915, he was sent to Fort Sam Houston. And in the fall of that year, Peacock Military Academy needed a football coach. They asked him. He refused at first, thinking he wouldn't have time, but then the head of the academy was a friend of the post commander, General Fred Funston. Funston learned about the offer and asked Eisenhower to accept it. He said it would be good for the Army. Eisenhower soon won recognition for his coaching ability, and a San Antonio Express correspondent wrote, "Those who have seen this officer operate with a football squad believe him to be one of the best coaches in Texas, bar none." They had a winning season. But like many in his generation, President Eisenhower smoked cigarettes, 2 to 3 packs a day. He had a heart attack when I was 10 years old. He was only 60 then. And after his heart attack, people say he was never the same. But in terms of the President's Council on Physical Fitness, it wouldn't have mattered because he turned that over to Richard M. Nixon, a quirky sloucher with no understanding of fitness whatsoever. After Eisenhower came John F. Kennedy, and he understood fitness. Unfortunately, he too was swept up in football, and he was small and fragile. From his earliest days, he was out there, banging away. And then he went to Harvard, played on the junior varsity team, second row, third from the right. Blew out his back, and it haunted him for the rest of his life. He was also on the swim team, and it would later save his life and the life of another sailor. Top row, third from the left. Take a look at the photo on the left. That's young JFK and his older brother Joseph. They both served in the Navy. Joseph never came home. Now over on the right, far right, you see John F. Kennedy. He was the commander of a PT boat, patrol torpedo, they're called. Now look carefully and you can see that his spine is crooked. Those early football injuries cost him dearly. That's his PT boat on the left. And on the right, you see what happened. A destroyer virtually cut it in half. 2 crew members were never seen again, but 11 who survived, all wearing life vests, managed to board what was left of PT-109. One had been badly burned and couldn't swim. Eventually, they abandoned ship. Lieutenant Kennedy, who suffered a ruptured spinal disc in the collision, eventually towed the injured sailor 3.5 miles to an island. He received the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for Valor and a Purple Heart. One of the things I remember most about JFK was his interest and understanding of the value of education. He said, "A child miseducated is a child lost," a simple but powerful sentence that I took seriously. He also said, "I want to emphasize in the great concentration which we now place upon scientists and engineers, how much we still need the men and women educated in the liberal tradition, willing to take on the long look, undisturbed by prejudices and slogans of the moment, who attempt to make an honest judgment of difficult events." Think about that. That all died in Dallas in 1963. Now, when we say liberal today, it has its own meaning. But what did he mean back then by a liberal tradition? Let's take a closer look. On the right is artes liberalis, which simply means the art of making oneself free. On the left, artes civilis, servile arts, the art of making a living. And as you can see, most people today spend the most time making a living and are poorly educated in the liberal arts that make them free. Aristotle said it, People whose days are consumed by material necessity cannot tend to the higher things. What a sad way to live. The art of making a living compared to subjects considered worthy of free people so they can actively participate in civic life. At a minimum, society should spend an equal amount of time on both. And in order to do that, they must be physically ready. They must be economically productive. Their borders must be secure. And only then can they seek cultural evolution. So what do you do in your free time? You have three choices then: recreation, amusement, and leisure. And they are not the same. Recreation is the lowest form. It simply gets you ready to go back to the factory the next day. Amusement is higher. Think of the muses: art, music, poetry, those things that make us wonder. But of course, if society begins to die, the music, the art, and the poetry begin to devolve, as does the language. But the highest form is leisure. The Greek word skole, the Latin scola, the English is school. I didn't know this when I was a kid, but now I get it. The ideal of school, what a precious time, when all of our needs are met and we can seek a life of higher meaning. Take a look at a school today. It'll make you want to cry. So, skole, scola, and school leads to what? Education, from the Latin educare, to lead out of. There are three domains of education: cognitive, affective, and motor. Cognitive is the mind, affective emotions, and motor is movement. And they all interact. Destroy one, you injure the other two. We call the motor learning physical education, and it has three components: medical, military, or pedagogical. You can also call them restorative, martial, and pedagogical. The training formula: rational progression, variety, and precision. You must have all three. So let's take a look now at physical education. We have education of the physical and education through the physical. The Greeks called it euxia and eutaxia. Education of the physical simply means the way we learn to walk, talk, sit, run, jump, climb, breathe. And through the physical is what happens to us by learning it in a particular way. We would hope to develop courage, discipline, wisdom, honesty, integrity, productivity, but it doesn't always work well, does it? And that brings us to paradigm 21. This is the ideal paradigm. That box is physical education. On the left, we see the function. We do things for ourselves. We do them for others. Now, at the lowest interpersonal level, we might do things for our family, our team, our neighborhood, our gender, our ethnicity. In the middle, we begin to think in terms of our country. We sacrifice our personal needs for our nation. And all the way up there at the border of the transpersonal, we begin to understand that all people, anywhere in the world, are all equally humans, that there is only one race. It's called the human race. And if we grow and grow, we will suddenly understand that the body is a temple, and we should treat it as such. If we live always at the personal level, the body is a toy. If we grow to the interpersonal, it'll become a tool. We'll begin to take care of it. If we stay at the bottom, Beavis and Butthead, Jackass, all of that, the body is nothing more than a toy that we destroy and abuse. And at the top, at the transpersonal, then the body is a divine temple. At the top, we look at the content, the restorative and the martial and the pedagogical. See? Here we are, understanding that we will all die, but yet somehow we are connected to God, to the divine. His nickname was Novalis, a German mystic. There is but one temple in the world, and that is the body of man. Nothing is holier than this high form. We touch heaven when we lay our hands on a human body. How many people think this way? And what a wonderful world if we all understood this. You see? And notice in the ideal paradigm, the top regions are darker. That's where the emphasis lies. And down below, we see a precarious balance between culture and leisure. So let's look at physical culture. It comes from the word cultus, cult. When we say cult today, we often think of it in a pejorative term, but it is simply the search for and celebration of the divine unknown. And it balances precariously on this concept called leisure, skole, scola, and school. Take a final look. Restorative content. Techniques obvious or subtle that bring the body toward its highest state of readiness and compensate for the stresses of daily life. Martial. Techniques obvious or subtle that allows for appropriate response to external aggression. That can be close range, medium range, or weapons. Pedagogical. Sports, games, theoretical bodies of knowledge, and dance. Today in our society, our emphasis is on the pedagogical. So what does it look like in a society where the restorative and the martial are highly evolved and focused on the transpersonal? This is Yeonggyu, 1502 to 1592. He was a Korean Buddhist monk, a militia leader who fought in the Imjin War. He was killed in the Third Battle of Gumsan in 1592. Or the Knights Templar, circa 1119 to 1312, warrior monks who served Christ. Or look at the Great Seal of the United States. Olive branches and arrows. Peace, wisdom, knowledge on the left, arrows on the right. But notice the eagle always looks toward peace. How many have ever looked carefully at this wonderful vision for our nation? So here we are, an ideal paradigm that we can use no matter where you live. You can evaluate your physical culture. And in the United States, here we are, quickly devolving. And it will inevitably collapse as we focus on the personal, pedagogical, sports and games, theoretical bodies of knowledge and dance for our personal gain and satisfaction. Here we are. Rudyard Kipling said it. Nations have passed away and left no traces, and history gives the naked cause of it. One single reason in all cases, they fell because their peoples were not fit. And we're left with a simple question then, in the United States, what then shall we do?